Great, thanks folks for coming back, not just escaping at lunchtime, much appreciated. We had such a good morning of presentations and discussions, so I'm really looking forward to this, our last session for today. I'm sure lots of us enjoyed hearing from Benito earlier, but to give him a formal and proper welcome, I've been making lots of notes. Benito is the Special Envoy to the Premier of the BVI, currently working in Washington, DC. As BVI representative to the UK and the EU, he's been involved in Brexit, although apparently we can't hold him personally responsible. And he's represented the BVI in a number of different initiatives, including and up to the current kind of situation that they find themselves in. He's a member for the International Institute for Strategic Studies and has, amongst other things, a Master's in Diplomacy from LSE and is also a continuing fellow of the University of Southampton. And Cambridge. University of Cambridge. I'm so sorry. I wrote the wrong university down. That's completely put me off my stride. He has responsibilities including engagement with the UK, with CARICOM, with the UN, with the OECS and the ACS, and has been involved in many different interesting events, including that have involved the UK and overseas territories and the BVI in general. And last but very much not least, he was also Diplomat Magazine's Diplomat of the Month, November 2015. And I feel it would have been remiss of me to let that go unnoted. And I was meant to start with reminding everyone about our ground rules, about Chatham House rules and the like. We will have, I think, about 40 minutes and then 20 minutes or so for questions. And with no further ado, I introduce Benito Wheatley, who's going to present on the urgent need for a new modern partnership.
Okay.
Thank you, Benito.
Well, thank you, Kate, for the very kind introduction, and also for the warm welcome that I received here in London last night after a very, very, very cold and rainy day. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Let me first thank Peter for the generous invitation to deliver this afternoon's keynote address and to participate in this timely workshop. Over the years, Peter and I have worked very closely together, and I applaud him for his continued efforts to bring greater academic attention to the overseas territories, and also for his work in encouraging the United Kingdom to provide more support to these small polities scattered around the world that remain constitutionally linked to Britain. For those of you who are unaware, Peter is the UK's foremost academic expert on the subject of the OTs. I encourage you to read his work, which I believe would help to put the UK's relationship with the territories into perspective. I also want to commend the Institute of Commonwealth Studies for hosting. I genuinely hope this workshop will contribute to the much-needed dialogue on better managing and improving the unique relationship between the UK and OTs. Let me preface my remarks by stating that the views I express here are based on my observations and analysis as a practitioner in the field over several years. The UK's relationship with the OTs is a delicate one. While we often speak about the OTs as a bloc, they are not a homogeneous group. The territories are at different stages of development and have their own distinct features. Regardless of their level of development and particular circumstances, the UK has pledged to be a partner at both bilateral and group levels. This was cemented in the 1999 OT White Paper, Partnership for Progress and Prosperity, that was succeeded in 2012 by the OT White Paper, Security, Success, and Sustainability. These successive policy documents set out the UK's approach to a modern partnership with the territories to move further away from a colonial relationship. The basic idea was that with better UK support and mutual responsibility, the OTs would be more secure and sustainable, and that as communities, they would flourish socially, economically, and politically. However, in recent years, this modern partnership has encountered serious problems. We have already discussed today several of the key issues, but the major flashpoints are Brexit, financial services, constitutional overreach, and governance. The handling of these issues over time has seen a weakening of the modern partnership. It is no secret that the position of the OTs in the Brexit negotiations was not handled well by the UK, if at all. In the final analysis, the OTs lost their associate status in the EU, lost their free trade arrangements with the EU, and lost access to EU development assistance, which the UK still has yet to fully replace. One can understand how the OT's confidence in their modern partnership with the UK would be diminished after their political leaders, in good faith, attended multiple UK Joint Ministerial Council meetings on Brexit negotiations for the territories, which resulted in absolutely nothing except duty-free access to the EU market for Tristan da Cunha. Notably, Gibraltar had a separate consultative mechanism whose outcomes were different and are still being worked out. In 2018, the UK Parliament's decision to impose public registers of beneficial ownership on the OTs broke the established convention of the UK not legislating for the territories without their consent in devolved areas of constitutional responsibility. This was compounded by the UK government's threat to bring into force a draft order in council for non-compliance. Constitutional strains also exist at the bilateral level. Notable examples are the UK government's refusal to permit the governor of Bermuda to assent to a bill passed by the Bermuda Parliament to legalize cannabis for recreational purposes. Another was the decision of the governor of the Cayman Islands to legislate domestic partnerships for same-sex couples after the Cayman Parliament initially voted down the very same legislation. No opportunity was given for a referendum so the public could have their say. Finally, the UK government is maintaining an order in council and reserve over the British Virgin Islands that can remove democracy through the partial suspension of the Constitution if the UK deems that governance reforms are not being implemented satisfactorily. Previously in 2009, the UK imposed direct rule over the Turks and Caicos Islands. These are all cases where the UK has retrenched from its modern partnership with the OTs in recent years. The reasons for this are structural in nature. It is the structure of the UK's constitutional relationship with the territories and the tools available to the UK to ensure their compliance that creates the conditions that are weakening the modern partnership. Importantly, the primacy of the UK Parliament over the territories subjects them to the internal politics of that institution, which has been shifting continuously as of late under Conservative Party rule. In fact, it was the weak position of the Theresa May government that caused them to buckle under parliamentary pressure to impose public registers of beneficial ownership on the OTs. This was not the May government's initial position. However, once the UK Parliament makes a decision, the UK government is obliged to implement it, even if it is counter to the interests of the territories. What are the UK government's tools to compel the territories to follow through if they disagree? Well, we know from recent experience that they are orders in council or the threat of an order in council to pressure the territories to do as instructed. On the ground in the territories themselves, governors may also activate their reserve powers to make a decree in line with UK government policy, or the governor may simply withhold assent to bills the UK disagrees with. The structural problem I am highlighting is the democratic deficit in the UK's relationship with the OTs. The impact of that democratic deficit on the modern partnership is as follows. The greater the democratic deficit, the weaker the modern partnership becomes. The weaker the modern partnership becomes, the more difficult it is to manage the UK's relationship with the territories. Difficulties in managing the UK's relationship with the territories can lead to a breakdown in relations or even a crisis. What are the international implications of this? A significant weakening of the modern partnership presents a perception problem for global Britain and its image as a force for good in the world, especially among developing countries in the Caribbean, Latin America, and Africa. It gives the impression that the OTs are in fact just really British colonies which the UK deals with as they wish. Britain's colonial past feeds into this narrative. It is in fact the case that the UK's international reputation has already been somewhat damaged by this perception, especially at the UN Special Committee on Decolonization, the UN Fourth Committee, and UN General Assembly. The UK's handling of the long-standing Chagos Islands issue and the recent BVI crisis captured a great deal of attention, international attention, and has concerned many. In addition to global Britain's international image problem, there is also the local perception of the people of the territories themselves that they must be concerned about. Where the relationship is locally viewed as a colonial one, it breeds distrust and suspicion of the UK and its intentions. That is why the tools employed by the UK in the management of its relationship with the territories is extremely important. In this regard, let me just say a few words about the recent crisis in the BVI after a Commission of Inquiry report on governance was released. The UK government made the correct decision to not impose direct rule on the territory as recommended by the report, but to alternatively allow the local government to carry out reforms. There was no need to collectively punish the people of the territory for the actions of one man or a small group of people. The reform process is going reasonably well and demonstrates that removing democracy and violating human rights is not the answer to fixing things. There are greater gains in the local leadership taking responsibility for addressing the problems in governance, which is exactly what democracy is meant to do. Democracy is the vehicle for course correction. It is not the problem. Global Britain's relationship with its partners in CARICOM, OECS, the Caribbean OTs, the wider Caribbean, and the Commonwealth hung in the balance of the BVI crisis because of the unacceptable idea of direct rule in this modern democratic era and very, very strong feelings about Britain's colonial past and current calls for reparations for slavery. What they expected from global Britain is a firm commitment to democracy, regardless of where the society is and who the people are. It would have been a public relations nightmare for the UK to be seen to be removing democracy from a territory when Britain itself is supporting Ukraine's struggle against Russia to preserve their freedom. On the positive side of things, a model is developing out of the BVI crisis that holds important lessons for the UK and OTs. UK support for the territories cannot simply be about mitigating contingent liabilities. It has to be about a genuine UK investment in the OTs to provide them with ongoing support to help build and develop their institutions and systems of government. A crisis should not have to occur for the level of support needed to be offered. Let me be clear. I am not saying that the UK's current relationship with the OTs is wholly inadequate or dysfunctional. In fact, the UK demonstrated the best of what a modern partnership can be with its support for COVID response during the pandemic and its disaster response after the 2017 hurricanes in the Caribbean. But there is ample room for improvement. However, the mutual benefit of the UK's relationship with the territories cannot be optimized without a shift in approach that considers the OT's ongoing needs, the current international environment, changes in the UK political and economic landscape, and conditions on the ground in the territories. I should point out here that the OTs have been asking for some time for a dialogue around this, especially after the Brexit referendum result. Calls have also been made for a new OT white paper. The UK government's response has been that the existing relationship is still the right one. However, at this juncture, especially after Brexit and the BVI crisis, this argument can no longer hold. For our purposes today, we should think about what a new modern partnership could look like. Already here in the UK, there have been some attempts at shaping a new relationship in response to the severe strains between the UK and OTs. The House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee published a report in 2019 entitled Global Britain and the British Overseas Territories, Resetting the Relationship. Among other things, it highlighted the OT's value to the UK as environmental assets because of their rich biodiversity and vast marine space. While the report contains some good recommendations, its authors espoused the view that the territories as a part of the British family must accept undemocratic UK impositions on them, regardless of how it affects their economic, political, social, and cultural interests. Furthermore, the report sought to legitimize the use of orders in council as instruments of UK policy toward the territories to meet certain political, social, and economic objectives without their consent and against their will. In my view, the report is a non-starter because it seeks to reinforce the democratic deficit that already exists, which is weakening the modern partnership. In terms of the UK government, in its integrated review of Global Britain's defense, security, development, and foreign policy, the territories were briefly mentioned in terms of security. However, very little was said about the people and communities of these places. As for the territories themselves, they have yet to collectively offer their own vision for a new modern partnership with the Global Britain. A great deal of consultation will be required because of regional differences, levels of economic development, differences in political advancement, and varying political aspirations. I would like to offer some of my own thoughts on a new modern partnership to make the overall relationship fit for purpose in this era. A new modern partnership has to have a people-first approach. The environment and other things are secondary. Helping the people of the overseas territories to realize their full potential and aspirations should be at the heart of the partnership. This should then be tied to the sustainable development of the territories based on the Sustainable Development Goals agreed in 2015 by the UN that are a standard for humanity. They cover everything, including climate change. The UK's role should go beyond the UK fending off external threats, ensuring law and order, and the basic functioning of government in the territories. A new modern partnership should also avoid the current structural problem that has weakened the existing partnership. The democratic deficit needs to be closed. The standard UK line to the rest of the world is that the territories are largely self-governing, except where the UK retains the necessary powers to dispense its international obligations. However, there is a problem where these international obligations are underpinned by unilateral authority and a lack of democratic accountability. A different approach to gaining compliance by the territories on matters of strategic importance to the UK can be achieved through alternative tools other than orders in council or the threat of using them. Diplomacy and political engagement can in fact achieve positive results. A good example of this is the public registers of beneficial ownership issue. As I mentioned earlier, a draft order in council was laid before the UK Parliament to compel the OTs to comply with the relevant UK legislation. However, the UK government's approach to the Crown dependencies on the same issue was different. In fact, the UK was able to secure the same commitment from them without the same threat. It was not that the cities were not pressured, they were. But different tools were employed to get them to commit. The typical argument against this is that the Crown dependencies have a different constitutional relationship with the UK, so the same methods cannot be employed with them as the OTs. They have a direct relationship with the monarchy, and the UK government must get their consent before moving forward with legislation or policy on their behalf or forcing legislation on them. This is the kind of constitutional structure that could help to close the democratic deficit between the UK and OTs and reduce friction. It needs to be considered in looking at a new modern partnership. And for those who argue against such a change, I would have to assume it is because they believe the UK should have at its disposal the tools of unilateral authority, such as orders in council, to impose or compel things on the territories as they see fit without democratic legitimacy or accountability. Where such views are held in the UK political and policy establishment, a change of mindset would be required. They would need to see the territories as places and people who deserve to have their consent sought by the UK before decisions are made for them, and who should be respected and valued enough to be engaged on democratic and consensual terms, even when it comes to UK interests. Finally, the standard for a new modern partnership should fully respect international law. Article 73 of the UN Charter and all of the relevant UN conventions and resolutions should be respected by the UK. In order to meet its international obligations as an administering power of several territories, the UK has an obligation to help the territories achieve a full measure of self-government in line with the options for self-determination set out by the UN. This means full decolonization. The process is not simply a question of whether the OTs wish to remain British, which is the standard UK line, which I know works for some territories that have specific political circumstances. But it is also a question of whether a territory wants to be integrated into the UK, or have a free association with the UK or another state, or become an independent nation. OT status was always meant to be preparatory and transitional in nature until a territory arrived at a point of being able to decide its political future. This is the UN standard. Constitutional advancements thus far have been exercises in dependency modernization as opposed to change of political status. The UN calls upon all administering powers to help bring the UN sanctioned options to the attention of the people of those territories categorized as non-self-governing territories. Most of the British overseas territories are in that category. If global Britain wants to continue to be a force for good in the world and a champion for political freedom and human rights, it is important that it observe international law regarding the non-self-governing territories. The UK previously offered associated statehood status to former colonies to help them prepare to make a decision on their political future. But this has been taken off the table for some time now. However, if a dialogue on constitutional structure does happen in the future, the UK should reopen discussion on associated statehood status. This would enable the UK to meet its international obligation to support the territories in attaining a full measure of self-government and close the democratic deficit that currently exists. As I close, I would like to say that the UK and OTs are today in a much better position to have a dialogue on a new modern partnership because we have a UK Overseas Territories Minister in Lord Goldsmith who is genuinely interested in the territories and their people. My impression is that he sincerely wants to improve the UK's relationship with the territories. I also believe Foreign Secretary James Cleverly is genuinely interested in the OTs, despite all of his immense responsibilities. There is a window of opportunity at the upcoming Joint Ministerial Council in May to kick things off and make some progress ahead of the next UK general election. Time is very short, and it will require a dedicated effort by all concerned. Peter, I believe the report of this conference can help to provide a basis for that dialogue. I also want to encourage all of our academic partners represented here today to remain engaged and involved. University of the West of England, University of Central London, University of Cambridge, and of course we have institutionally the Caribbean Council. Your contributions are vital. Thank you again for this opportunity to address the workshop. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. I thank you.